Do you believe that the dead can walk among us? What if, on an ordinary night, you crossed paths with something that should never have come out of the darkness? That's exactly what happened to me on the A229 road. And I'll tell you everything. But be careful. This story is not for the faint of heart. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Would you face a damn road at night? The night started like any other. I was leaving a dinner with old friends in Maidstone, laughing and saying goodbye in the light rain. It was one of those typical winter nights in the UK. Pitch black skies, with the soft sound of drops drumming on the bonnet of the car. The A229 was in front of me, a road I knew by heart, but which always carried a different aura at night. Not that I believed in ghosts, of course, but there was something about driving down that deserted path that always left me uneasy. The headlight illuminated the narrow road, surrounded by gnarled trees that cast jagged shadows on the asphalt. The mist began to form as I passed the intersection with Pilgrim's Way, that ancient road with centuries of stories embedded in its soil. I had heard stories about the A229, but always dismissed them as tales to scare children. But that night, something felt different. The silence was heavier than usual, and even the sound of the engine seemed muffled. While driving, I started to feel a strange discomfort, a kind of pressure in my chest that I couldn't explain. My gaze was involuntarily drawn to the rear-view mirror, as if something was behind me. Of course, there was nothing, just the empty back seats and the darkness outside. But that feeling of being watched was almost tangible, like someone was breathing too close. I tried to ignore it, turning up the volume on the radio. An upbeat pop song started playing, but instead of relieving the tension, it just seemed out of place, like it didn't belong there. The rain began to thicken, and the sound of drops against the windshield took on an irregular cadence. The road seemed longer than usual, almost endless. I passed a familiar point, the entrance to Bluebell Hill, a place many avoid mentioning because of local legends. They say that the ghost of a bride killed in a car accident appears on the side of the road, asking for a ride before disappearing. But that night, it wasn't a bride who crossed my path. Suddenly, the car's lights flashed, something that had never happened before. It must be the fuses, I thought, trying to convince myself that it was just a mechanical problem. However, from that moment on, I began to feel an almost imperceptible change in the air inside the car. The smell of rain gave way to something metallic, like rust or old blood. My body was on alert. The hairs on my arms were standing on end, and I refused to look in the rearview mirror again. I remembered something I heard as a child. On the A229, never look in the mirror at night. You might not like what you see. I laughed to myself at the idea, but the laughter died quickly. When the headlight illuminated a wider section of the road, I swear I saw a shadow crossing ahead. It was fast, almost like a speed, but enough to make me instinctively hit the brakes. The car skidded a little before stopping. I looked around, looking for any sign of life, but there was no one. Not even the sound of birds or insects. Just the crushing silence and the rain. My heart was pounding, and I convinced myself I was exaggerating. I was tired, that's all. I put the car in gear and started driving again, but that feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. That's when I heard it for the first time. a low sound, almost like a whisper. Oliver. That was my name. I stopped breathing for a moment, frozen. The sound was coming from inside the car. The sound couldn't be real. My name, Oliver, echoed inside the car, as if the words were being breathed directly into my ear. I turned my head quickly toward the back seat, my breath catching in my chest. Darkness. Nothing but a shadowy void and the uneven glow of the headlights reflected inside the vehicle. Even so, the feeling of a presence there was suffocating, almost as if the air had become denser, heavier. My fingers gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned, white as I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was the sound of the engine, or a strange noise from the rain that my brain interpreted as a voice. Yes, that was it. It needed to be that. I turned the radio back on, looking for some distraction. But what came was not music, but a static hiss, as if the station had been swallowed up by interference. Something began to emerge from that sound. Words, weak at first but soon clearer, formed sentences that seemed to claw at my mind. "You shouldn't be here." The phrase was repeated with overlapping voices. Some whispered, others shouted. I turned off the radio in a sudden movement, the knob turning so fast I almost ripped it off. The silence returned. But now it was even worse, because it seemed full of expectations, as if something was about to happen. I tried to focus on the road, forcing my eyes to ignore the shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of my field of vision. The rain was heavier, and the sound of the windshield wipers was mesmerizing. But there was something else, a low noise, like wet boots on gravel. But I was driving. There was no way anyone was walking around there. My stomach dropped when I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. He was inside the car. I looked in the rearview mirror again, even against my instinct. It was impossible, but in that brief moment, something was there. A dark silhouette sitting in the back seat. Just a flash. A vision so quick I almost doubted myself. But the impact of it was like a blow to the chest, leaving my breathing ragged and my mind spinning in panic. Reduced the speed. I couldn't continue like this. I needed to stop and understand what was happening. A short distance away, I saw a small shoulder on the right, dimly lit by headlights. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and the rain seemed to trickle in, intensity, as if nature itself was trying to stop me from leaving. I sat there, motionless, the sound of the drops echoing off the tinwork like a frantic drum. My reflection in the rearview mirror seemed darker, more distorted, almost unrecognizable. It was the first time in my life that I felt completely alone and vulnerable, as if the world around me had changed into an alternate, sinister version. Then something hit the passenger window, a dry, rhythmic sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. I turned my head slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no one there, but the sound continued, insistent. My palm was sweaty as I pulled the door latch, hesitating, before opening it. As soon as the door was unlocked, the sound stopped. Not just the sound of the banging, but all the noise around me. The rain had suddenly stopped, and the world seemed to have fallen into absolute silence. Even the sound of my own heart felt muffled, as if something had sucked all the life out of that place. I got out of the car, stepping into the sodden mud. The darkness around me was almost solid, an opaque shroud that swallowed everything within a few feet. I held the cell phone tightly, shining the flashlight on the ground in front of me as I looked for any sign of movement. That's when I saw the footprints. They were fresh, lined up in a trail that seemed to start out of nowhere, crossing the road and disappearing into the dense forest beside it. Each step was marked by the same impression. Military boots, huge, like those worn by soldiers. But there was no one around, just me, the car, and those impossible marks that seemed to call me into the forest. I should have gone back to the car. Everything in my body screamed for me to run away. But there was something about those footprints that attracted me, as if an invisible force was pulling me. The feeling of being watched came over me as soon as I took the first step towards the trail. The ground, damp and covered in leaves, seemed to murmur beneath my feet, as if whispering secrets of things that preferred to remain hidden. It made no sense to follow those footsteps, but my curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, pushed me forward. The light from my cell phone flashlight flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the trees around me. They seemed to lean in, watching my every move like silent witnesses to something I didn't yet understand. The air had a strange, metallic smell, almost like fresh blood mixed with wet earth. The silence was absolute, so dense that every sound I made felt like a scream. I looked back, expecting to see my car parked on the road, a safety anchor in the chaos. But he was covered in a sudden, inexplicable fog, which made him seem more and more distant, as if he were being swallowed by another dimension. As I walked forward, the footsteps I had heard before began again. This time, it wasn't an echo. It was real. They were coming from somewhere in front of me, heavy and deliberate, breaking branches and crushing leaves. My heart raced, but something in me stopped me from running. I needed to know what was there, what was calling to me with such an irresistible force. It was then that I heard the singing. It was not a comforting melody, but a deep lament, interspersed with moans. It sounded ancient, as if it had been sung centuries ago, but at the same time it was there, so close that the vibration could almost be felt on my skin. The words were incomprehensible, but they carried such an oppressive weight that it seemed difficult to breathe. My flashlight found something unexpected. A figure formed among the trees, slowly emerging, as if the darkness itself was carving its body. It was a man, or what was left of one. He was wearing an old military uniform, torn and stained with mud and dried blood. His eyes, or what should have been in their place, were two black holes, empty but filled with an overwhelming hunger. My legs gave way, and the lantern fell to the floor. The light spun, creating a grotesque spectacle of moving shadows. The figure didn't move, but its wail became louder, as if it were screaming inside my head. I covered my ears, trying to block out that sound, but it seemed to come from inside me, echoing in my soul. Suddenly, he stopped. The silence returned with even greater weight, and I felt like something had changed. When I raised the flashlight, again, he was no longer there. The footprints, however, continued. This time they looked fresher, as if they had just been made. Without knowing why, I continued forward. the fear being replaced by a morbid curiosity that I couldn't control. The forest seemed to open up into a clearing, where a pale, unearthly light illuminated the space. In the center, there was something that looked like a makeshift memorial. An old wooden cross with names precariously engraved on it. Withered flowers and a rusty military helmet lay at her feet. I approached it, hesitantly, and then I realized that the names on the cross were not strange. One of them was mine. I was frozen, unable to process what that meant. The voice returned, this time right behind me. "You shouldn't be here." The world seemed to shake around me, and a feeling of vertigo came over me. The presence was there, stronger than ever, and I knew I wasn't just being watched. I was being hunted. The idea of running seemed logical, but my body didn't obey. I remained motionless, with my eyes fixed on the cross in front of me, trying to understand how my name could be there. The words carved into the wood, rough and worn by time, seemed to pulse as if they had a life of their own. The rusty helmet next to it gave off an odor of rust mixed with something more putrefied. A sharp sound erupted behind me, a crack that echoed like thunder amid the oppressive silence. I turned toward the noise, but the flashlight flickered, casting jumbled shadows on the trees. There was nothing there, at least not that I could see. The sound of breathing, low and rhythmic, made me flinch. It was close, so close that I could feel the heat of its presence in the air. The surrounding fog began to move, slithering like snakes between the trees. It was dense, almost solid, and seemed to form figures, indistinct faces that came and went so quickly that I didn't know if they were real or the result of my fear. The forest, which had once felt suffocating, was now alive, pulsing with a dark energy that enveloped me. Suddenly, he appeared again, the soldier. Now, sharper than before, with details I wish I hadn't noticed. His hands were disproportionate, long and skeletal, covered in a tissue of skin that seemed ready to tear. His uniform, although recognizable, looked wrong, out of place, in time, as if it had been dragged through decades of degradation. "You don't belong here," he said, the voice not coming from his mouth, but echoing directly in my mind. The words carried an indescribable pain, as if each syllable was a fragment of accumulated suffering. I wanted to respond, to ask why, but my voice was swallowed by fear. He raised one hand, pointing to the cross behind me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and when I looked back, I realized something had changed. The cross was covered in a viscous substance, black as pitch, which slowly oozed out and formed a pattern on the floor. A pattern that, to my horror, I realized was the same as the footprints I had followed there. The fog began to swirl around us, forming a circle that isolated me. It was as if the outside world had ceased to exist. The soldier took a step forward, and the earth beneath his feet creaked. He was closer now, and his eyes, or lack thereof, seemed to suck in my very essence. "They told me to stay. Now, you stay too." His voice resounded once more, and the air around me became heavy. As if the oxygen was being drained, the trees seemed to lean, the shadows approaching as if they were accomplices in that moment. My legs finally responded, and I started back, tripping over my own footprints. The clearing seemed to stretch out, as if it were distorting to keep me there. The soldier didn't advance, but his presence was enough to make my mind spin in a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Then it happened. The mist around me exploded in a flash of pale light, revealing something that was buried in the earth. A hand, or what was left of it, emerged from the ground, holding what appeared to be an old military medal. The metal was worn, but it still reflected the light from the flashlight in a way that looked unnatural. I felt like that object was important, as if it were a piece of a puzzle that I didn't know I was trying to put together. But at the same time, the fear of touching him was almost uncontrollable. The soldier didn't take his eyes off me, and I knew he was waiting for my next action. The choice was mine: run and leave that mystery behind, or face whatever was buried in that clearing. And at that moment, I had the terrible feeling that whatever decision I made was already predicted, written somewhere far beyond my control. I can't say what made me take the next step. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something in that clearing was manipulating me, directing my actions like a puppet in the hands of an unseen master. With an effort that seemed to tear a piece out of me, I knelt before that hand emerging from the earth. The cold from the ground penetrated my clothes, and the feeling of being watched intensified. The soldier remained motionless, as if the decision I was about to make was the climax he had been waiting for decades. I touched the metal hesitantly, and an unexpected warmth ran through my arm, as if the object were alive. It was light, almost fragile, but the contact seemed to awaken something. The air around me shuddered, and a wave of sound ran through the forest, as if the earth itself was screaming. The previously inert hand grabbed my wrist with inhuman strength, and a scream escaped my throat. I pulled on my arm with all my might, and the hand let go, but not before it left a mark on my skin, a circular pattern that burned as if it had been etched with iron. When I looked back at the ground, the hand was gone, as if it had never existed. All that was left was the metal, now weighing like lead in my palm. "You opened the door," the soldier's voice resounded, but this time it seemed closer, almost next to me. I quickly turned around, but he was no longer there. The void left by his absence was even more disturbing than his presence. The clearing, once shrouded in mist, now seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the sounds of the forest returned, but in a distorted, almost unrecognizable form. Suddenly, the metal began to vibrate in my hand, emitting a low buzzing sound that seemed to resonate inside my head. Then, a vision hit me like a bolt of lightning. Images of soldiers marching, of screams suffocated by the mud of the trenches, of desperate eyes staring into space while invisible hands dragged them to their deaths. I was no longer in the clearing. I was there, in the middle of the war, feeling the anguish and terror that permeated every inch of that place. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, breathing heavily. The metal was still with me, but now its surface seemed even more worn, as if the simple act of holding it had sucked away part of its essence. The clearing, however, was different. The trees seemed closer, and the shadows had multiplied, each of them dancing in a chaotic pattern that defied logic. I stood up with difficulty, feeling the weight of what had happened. I didn't know what to do with the medal, but something told me that leaving it there wasn't an option. Every step I took to leave the clearing felt like a monumental effort, as if the ground itself was trying to trap me. When I finally got back to the trail, something made me stop. A sensation, an intuition. I looked back, and for a brief moment I saw the soldier again. He was not alone. Silhouettes began to emerge from the mist, one after another, each one more grotesque than the last. They were soldiers too, but deformed, mutilated in ways that defied understanding. His eyes, or what was left of them, shined with an intensity that seemed to burn my soul. "You freed us," they said in unison, their voices a cacophony of agony and resentment. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran like never before, the sound of footsteps crunching dry leaves behind me growing louder by the moment. I knew I couldn't stop. If I stopped, it would be the end. The world seemed to distort as he ran. The once familiar trail now felt endless, as if I were trapped in an endless loop of terror. But then, a flash of light appeared ahead. I didn't hesitate. Launching myself toward the exit, I crossed the border between the forest and the road, falling to my knees on the cold asphalt. I took a deep breath, feeling the momentary safety of the real world. But I knew it wasn't over. Something had come with me, something that could not be undone, and the medal, still firmly in my hand, seemed to pulse as if it were alive. On the A229 road, the sound of tires on wet asphalt echoed amid the silence. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but the relief of being out of that forest didn't last long. The headlights cut through the fog, revealing the empty road, but the feeling of being watched persisted, thicker than ever. It was as if the darkness around me was not just the absence of light, but something alive, something hungry. The silence was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. It wasn't coming from behind me, nor from the sides of the road. It seemed to be inside my head, but also beside me, following my every movement. I turned instinctively, but of course there was no one. Just the echo of what could or could not be real, eating away at what little sanity I had left. Suddenly, the headlights began to fail, flashing erratically. The car engine choked before dying completely, leaving me stuck in the middle of that cursed road. The fear returned with full force, making my breathing quicken. I knew I had made a mistake in taking that medal, but now it was too late for regrets. Her weight seemed to double every second, as if she wanted to drag me back into the forest. Out of nowhere, a figure emerged from the fog, standing in the center of the road. I didn't need much to recognize him. The soldier was back, but now he wasn't alone. Behind him, a line of indistinct shadows formed an army of the dead. Their faces, if they could be called that, were distorted by a mixture of suffering and hatred. What were once eyes were now black holes that sucked away any trace of hope. "You can't run away," the soldier said, his voice louder and firmer than before. "You freed us, but freedom has a price." My hands were shaking as I held the medal. It was hot, almost burning my skin. The instinct to throw it away was strong, but something deeper was stopping me. It was like part of me was connected to her, a bond that couldn't be broken. The soldier stepped forward, followed by his companions. Every movement made the temperature around me drop even further, as if the air itself was freezing. "Why me?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the fog. I didn't expect an answer, but he gave one. "Because you heard the call. You have crossed the line between the living and the dead. Now you carry the burden." His words fell on me like an unbearable weight. It wasn't just a question of surviving. I had become part of something much bigger and much darker. The shadows began to draw closer, closing the circle around me. Every step they took seemed to absorb what little light was left, plunging me into almost total darkness. Without thinking, I lifted the medal and squeezed it with all my strength. An intense heat radiated from her, making the shadows hesitate for a moment. It was enough for an insane idea to pop into my mind. Screaming, I threw the medal with all my strength towards the soldier. The object cut through the air, shining like a shard of sunlight before slamming into his chest. The impact was like a silent explosion. The medal disappeared in a flash of light, and the shadows receded as if they were being sucked into a vacuum. The soldier looked at me one last time, and in his eyes I saw something unexpected: gratitude. Then he and his companions disappeared, leaving only emptiness behind. The road was silent again, but something had changed. The weight I carried on my chest was now different. I knew it wasn't over. The medal was gone, but the bond between me and that dark world still existed. I turned to the car, which miraculously started running again with a tentative rumble. I got in, but before I started, I looked at the road one last time. The fog was beginning to lift, but deep down, I knew I would never truly be free. If you were as intrigued as I was, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave the comments saying what you thought of this story. Would you dare cross the A229 at night? Let's exchange ideas and theories in the comments.